What's happening, everybody? We got another fun UFC card this weekend. Brandon Royval taking on Taira Taira in the main event. And in this video, I'm going to break down everything you need to know to build some winning DraftKings lineups. So as you're watching this, do me a favor, like the video and subscribe to the YouTube channel. We recently crossed 100,000 subscribers. So thank you to everybody who is subbed. And if you aren't, join the party. It's totally free. It takes 5 seconds of your time. And also, we did a giveaway from last week. It was which fighter priced underneath Juliana Pena would score the most fantasy points. And not very many people got the question correct. And actually, there was less people even than had the right answer in the YouTube comments. Because I noticed a lot of people went back and edited their answer and changed it to Court McGee. But people who actually answered Court McGee were few and far between. So I randomized the few people that did get Court McGee correct. And the winner of the giveaway, it is Matt's Ancient Coins, who ended up picking Court McGee. So Matt, DM me on Twitter and I'll shoot you the link to get you a free subscription to our Stochastic Sims here for MMA. And if anybody else wants to sign up for our MMA product, link is down below in the YouTube description box. You could build all your lineups on our site. You could build up to 10,000 lineups at a time. You could simulate the slate. It's a really good process for figuring out which are the best individual fighters to be rostering, as well as what are the best lineup constructions. And I've simulated out the slate here, and I'm going to give you guys some of the results here, going fight by fight and breaking down the fighters I have the most exposure to. So let's start here with the main event. Brandon Royval taking on Taira Taira, and I'm looking to fade Taira going forward. I did fade him and bet against him in his last fight against Alex Perez, and I know that Taira won the fight, but I don't feel like it was a bad side to be on. Perez won the first round. He was a live betting favorite after the first round ended, even though he was a really big underdog going into the fight. And then he blows out his knee in the second round and kind of a freak accident. So Taira ends up picking up the win. He keeps his UFC win streak going. And now in a matchup against Brandon Royval, I'm going into it thinking like, okay, this is a big step up in competition for Taira Taira again. This might be another opportunity to maybe fade him. Here's the problem, though. I think this is a very good stylistic matchup for Taira, where you have a fighter in Brandon Royval who only defends takedowns at a 40% clip. And we've seen in some of his 5-round fights, him just being taken over and over again. And that's typically how guys go out and beat Brandon Royval. And that is the path to victory for Taira Taira. He's going to have to land takedowns against Brandon Royval. And if he's not able to do it, Royval is the much better striker. I also think he's better cardio and more output than Taira Taira. But ultimately, I do think the most likely scenario is that Taira is going to be able to land those takedowns and score pretty well on DraftKings. Now, with that said, the way I'm approaching building these lineups of mine from a GPP perspective, I'm still a little bit higher on the Brandon Royval side, and that's just due to an ownership gap between them. And it's still pretty close. You see right here, and I think it's a great fight to be targeting. I want to have it in pretty much all of my lineups, but I am getting to about 60% Royval compared to 40% Taira Taira, even though I'm picking Taira to win, and I think he probably ends up winning by submission because of the opportunities that will present themselves with the poor takedown defense of Brandon Royval. I do think there's enough uncertainty in the fight to where I don't think Taira should be north of 50% owned, whereas Royval is only pulling a little bit over 20% ownership here. So I think Royval is a pretty good leverage play for cash games. I think it makes a lot of sense just to be stacking the main event. So GPPs, still a good amount of Taira. I've got him in 40% of my lineups. But I like the leverage I'm getting on Brandon Royval. I do think the line is a little bit too wide, where Taira is now north of a minus 300 favorite. So it's a good matchup for Taira on paper, but I think the line is making it out to seem it's an even better matchup for Taira than it actually is. So Brandon Royval to Taira Taira, great fight to be targeting for GPPs. Due to ownership, I'm going to be higher on the Royval side unless there's some kind of crazy ownership update tomorrow where it makes it a little bit closer between the two. But picking Taira to win, Royval is my preferred GPP target. Brad Tavares taking on Jung Young Park. And a few years ago, I would have pretty easily picked Tavares to win this fight by decision because Jung Young Park is typically pretty dependent on his wrestling to win his fights. He lands just about 2 takedowns per 15 minutes, and he's overall a pretty well-rounded fighter. He's able to strike a good amount. He's got a little bit of power, although not necessarily a really potent finisher. He's able to resort to his wrestling. His takedown defense kind of suspect. I don't think that's going to be an issue in a matchup against Brad Tavares, who rarely looks to wrestle. But if you look at the way that Brad Tavares typically has won fights, like he's never been a guy who's been a title contender, but for a very long stretch of his career, he was a guy who was solidly ranked inside the top 10. And he did it by being actually kind of similar style to Jung Young Park, just being a really overall well-rounded fighter, Really good takedown defense for Brad Tavares. That is something that still is held up at this point in his career, 81% takedown defense on paper. But the reason I don't really want to be playing this fight is I don't think it's very likely for there to be a finish. And there are a lot of fights on this card that I think are going to be finishes and score well. So I think Jung Young Park is going to win. I think that there's going to be good enough takedown defense from Brad Tavares to keep it on the feet. And then it's just going to be a volume-based decision from Park in my best estimation of the most likely way this fight ends up playing out. And in that event, I think we're probably looking like 70, 80 fantasy points for Park in a win. He's projected right around 20% ownership, which isn't crazy popular or anything like that. But I think there's better spots to go to be contrarian and other spots with more upside. Even if Tavares wins, once again, I think it's going to be like a low output striking based decision. So I don't love him that much as a punt either. This is a fight that I don't have all that much interest in. The same cannot be said for this fight. Chidi Njokuani taking on Jared Gooden. I think this is one of the best, most fan-friendly fights on the entire card. Both of these guys fight at very high paces. They move forward. They both have big power. They also both have questionable durability. We've seen each of them finished a handful of times. So with all of that being in mind, I think this is a great, really fun fight to target for DFS purposes. Whoever wins, I think, is going to put up a pretty big score. And another one, too, where I think the line is probably a little bit too wide, because something that hasn't been too big of an issue for Chidi Njokuani in the UFC, but was a massive issue for him outside of the UFC, is really poor grappling and takedown defense. So we saw numerous times outside of the UFC where he would have issues where he'd get taken down, he would get submitted, he wouldn't be able to get up from bottom. There's also times we've seen Chidi Njokuani gas out. And with that being the case, Jared Gooden, who's a very capable submission grappler, we don't typically see him resort to the wrestling, but should he end up going to it in this fight, I think he'd end up looking like a favorite. It's hard to bank on him to do it because he's a guy who kind of comes and fights for the fight of the night bonus and has great wars. We've seen that in how many of his fights have won fight of the night? Actually, none of them, believe it or not. That's a little surprising to me. But he did get a performance of the night bonus in his last fight against Wellington Turman. I thought that could have been a fight of the night and a performance bonus on that particular card because Turman looked really good in the first round, and there was a great comeback and a knockout win by Jared Gooden in the second round there. So this fight between Gooden and Njokuani, I think it's going to be one that's going to be really competitive. Both of them are able to finish each other. And with that being the case, I think it's a fight we want to get a lot of exposure to for DFS purposes. We've got Njokuani project for 33% ownership and Gooden right now pulling 24%. I'm definitely going to want to be overweight to both sides of this fight. A little bit higher on the Njokuani side, but relative to ownership, I'm more overweight to the Jared Gooden side. Moving on to the next fight, we have Grant Dawson taking on Rafa Garcia. And I mean, Grant Dawson, the only issue with him here is he's $9,500. He's the biggest betting favorite on the entire card. The matchup against Rafa Garcia, I think it's going to be potentially kind of competitive in the first round because Garcia does have solid takedown defense. But as the fight goes on, I think the takedowns are going to come more and more easily for Grant Dawson. And we've seen a bunch of times that Grant Dawson builds as the fight goes. He's typically a little bit of a slow starter, and then he's usually dominating fighters by the time we get to the later rounds. So if you look at Grant Dawson, see his finishes. Yeah, so his finishes on the Contender Series: second round finish, second round finish, second round finish, third round finish, third round finish, third round finish. He did first round finish, but that was a loss against Bobby Green. Typically, you see Grant Dawson in extended fights, and his best rounds are either the second or third round, either wins by decision or a late finish. So with the exception being that fight against Bobby Green where he got finished early, the fights usually do get extended. And with Grant Dawson being $9,500, it is a little bit hard for me to get up to the salary. He's definitely the preferred play in this fight against Rafa Garcia. And Grant Dawson typically scores reasonably well and wins because he's reliant on the wrestling and grappling. He isn't much of a striker, but the $9,500 price tag, that's going to keep him from being somebody that I'm really prioritizing on the slate. I'll probably have around 20% of them. Yeah, that's what I've got right now. 24% of Grant Dawson, which I think is more or less reasonable. I just think there's too big of an opportunity cost to force like 30+% of Grant Dawson into lineups considering his price point. Next fight here, another one I don't have all that much interest in. Daniel Rodriguez taking on Alex Morono. And these are just two fighters who I think are pretty well past it at this point. Daniel Rodriguez is turning 40 soon. What is he? 30. Yeah, 38, and he turns 39 in a couple of months here. And then you've got a fighter on the other side of the fight, and Alex Morono, who's coming off a terrible performance against Niko Price, who's also fighting on this card. But look at the last handful of fights that D-Rod's been in. A loss to Neil Magny, where he got submitted. He got knocked out by Ian Gary in the first round. He got dominated by Kelvin Gastelum in a 3-round decision. So this is a matchup against Alex Morono that's going to be an easier one than his last couple of matchups. But still, even with that said, D-Rod has not shown all that much promise in his recent fights. And he's fairly expensive, too. He's nearly $9K on DraftKings for this fight. And Alex Morono on the other side, I just don't know how we trust him after that performance against Niko Price, where he was taken down 5 times, so I think D-Rod could land takedowns against Alex Morono if Niko Price is able to land takedowns. Niko Price also took that fight on short notice, and still Alex Morono, his cardio looked terrible. He was completely gassed out by the 3rd round. So when you consider that he's somebody who, in age, he's not all that old, 34 years old for Alex Morono. Not that he's young, but he's not like super old like D-Rod is. But the problem I have with Alex Morono, and considering how weathered he looked in that fight, is even if he's only 34, he's much older in fight years. He's been in a lot of wars. He's been finished a handful of times. So this is a fight that, I don't know. I think the winner is just going to score like moderately. And there's a lot of other fights that are better to target. So I'm not one that I'm all that interested in. I think it's ultimately going to go to the judges' scorecards. CJ Vergara taking on Ramazan Temirov. And one thing that I think is really interesting about this fight, we've got a Temirov making his UFC debut. He's 17-2 professionally. Big time power. If you look at his last handful of fights, I think he has 3 or 4 fights in a row that he's finished in the first round. And then also of his losses, it's been a minute since we've seen him lose. His last loss came in 2019 where he got submitted. And then he also had a decision loss in 2019 as well. But I do question the cardio a little bit of Temirov just because his recent fights have ended so quickly. Let's see, last 4 fights, he finished in 3 rounds, got a knockout in knockout in 3 minutes, knockout in 4 minutes, knockout in 1 minute, knockout in 4 minutes. And in the past, when he's been in fights that have gotten extended, he's certainly slowed down in the later stages of the fight. Now he's live to knock out Vergara in the early going. We've seen Vergara knocked down in a handful of his fights. He was actually knocked down twice in the first round against Daniel Lacerda. And that was one where really good on Vergara for surviving. He ended up absorbing 44 significant strikes, was knocked down twice, but then was able to weather the storm, comes back, gets a finish in the second round. And that is something that I think is a potential path here for CJ Vergara. If he's able to survive the first round onslaught of Temirov, I do think that there's a scenario where there's just not much left in the cardio department for Temirov in the second round, and Vergara could come back with a come-from-behind win. So a fight that I'm modestly interested in just because Temirov's path to victory, I think, is probably going to be a first or second round finish. Whereas if Vergara wins, I think that he could potentially be fighting in the second or third round against a gassed out version of Temirov, land takedowns, and then maybe get himself a finish. So a pretty good fight to be targeting. I'm going to prefer Temirov because I do think the more likely outcome is that he gets the early finish. But CJ Vergara is projected for very low ownership. And in the event that he's able to survive the early rounds, then I think he could come back and have a nice come from behind victory. So decent fight to be targeting for DFS, but I prefer the Temirov side. Next fight here, Jonathan Pierce against Pat Sabatini. And we've got Jonathan Pierce pulling a ton of ownership right now. We've got him projected for right around 40% ownership, whereas Pat Sabatini on the other side only pulling 26% ownership. And it's a fight that's very close to a pick 'em on the betting line right now. I understand why Jonathan Pierce is getting a little bit more love, at least in the DFS world, because he's a crazy good DraftKings scorer. He lands north of 5 significant strikes per minute. He also lands over 5 takedowns per 15 minutes. So whenever Jonathan Pierce wins a fight, it comes with a big DraftKings score. But this is a fight against Pat Sabatini, where Sabatini, I actually think, is a little bit better of a wrestler and a grappler than Jonathan Pierce. He just doesn't have quite the same output. So I think a lot of this is going to come down to who ends up landing the first takedown, because both of these guys very active in their wrestling. 5.24 takedowns landed per 15 minutes, like we said for JSP. And then you've got Pat Sabatini, who lands nearly 4 takedowns per 15 minutes, 3.73. And one thing about these fighters is even though both of them have really good wrestling offense, both of them struggle to defend takedowns. Pierce only defends takedowns at a 58% clip. Sabatini only defends takedowns at a 50% clip. So with both of these guys being aggressive wrestlers, I do think that we're going to see whoever shoots takedowns first, I think is probably going to hold the advantage and end up winning rounds. So I lean towards Pierce being that guy, and it's why I pick him to win, and I think he wins by decision. But I think the ownership gap is too wide between them. When you consider this is a fight that's priced as a pick'em at the sports books, but Pierce is projected for 40% ownership, and then you got Sabatini with ownership in the mid 20% range, I'd rather be overweight to the Sabatini side, especially in like single entry type contests where you might be getting massive amounts of leverage on the field. Whoever wins, I think, scores really well. So another good fight to be targeting for DraftKings purposes. But for leverage, I think Sabatini is a really strong leverage play to be getting to, considering that Pierce is right now projected to be the second most rostered fighter on the entire card. Next fight here, Themba Gorimbo taking on Nico Price. And Nico Price is somebody who had massively fun fights to watch earlier in his career. If you look at the fights that were the Vicente Luque fights, so I know he got submitted in the second round in their first appearance, but where's the rematch between them? Here was the rematch. I can't believe this wasn't a fight of the night. I know that it was on the Ferguson-Gaethje card, and that was the one that ended up winning fight of the night, but there should have been some sort of bonus for Nico Price and Vicente Luque, because this fight was insane. You could see it in the output, too. 130 significant strikes landed for Luque, 129 on the Nico Price side, and there's been a handful of fight of the nights and performance bonuses in Nico Price fights, but as a result, you've got a guy who comes in, he wears like, if you guys ever watched like Barry Bonds play baseball, he had like those gigantic guards that he wore on his elbows. That's like what Nico Price wears on his knees when he goes into the octagon now, because both his knees are pretty shot at this point in his career. And as a result of that, I just think it's going to be very hard for him to defend takedowns. He was already somebody who struggled to defend takedowns. I see just 62% takedown defense for his career. And that's typically what Themba Gorimbo is looking to do in the early going of his fights, is he is looking to wrestle, get guys down to the ground. He lands 4 takedowns per 15 minutes. And I'm not massively high on Gorimbo as a prospect or anything like that, but he seemingly always finds himself in favorable matchups, especially for DraftKings scoring. And I think this is another one against Nico Price. You know, many years ago, not many, but like 3 years ago or something like that, before the injuries started to pile up for Nico Price, I think I would have liked him to survive the early going and then maybe win in like the second or third round. Maybe I'd be playing second and third round props for Nico Price against Themba Gorimbo. But I don't know if this version of Nico Price still has that in him, considering how compromised he is physically. So as a pay-up option, I really like Gorimbo, mostly because in any of his wins, he typically scores well. He has a little bit of power on the feet. He goes to his wrestling a lot. He has submission skills as well. So going to pick Gorimbo to win, and he's a priority for me as a pay-up option. I currently have him in 35% of lineup. So good pay up option, Themba Gorimbo. He's also going to be fairly popular, though not quite as popular as Jonathan Pierce, but mid 30% projected ownership coming into Gorimbo. Next fight here, Junior Tafa against Sean Sharaf. And I don't really know what to say about this fight. Sharaf only has 4 professional fights, and he's also taking this fight on short notice. It was supposed to be Chris Barnett who was fighting, and Chris Barnett is one of the most fun heavyweights on the UFC roster. Unfortunately, his house, I believe, might have been destroyed by one of the recent hurricanes in Florida, which sucks because Chris Barnett, by all accounts, seems to be a really, really cool and really fun fighter to watch, and definitely one of the good guys in the MMA space. So hopefully everything is going okay with him. But now you got this guy, Sharaf, who takes the fight on short notice. He only has 4 professional fights. And I go to watch the fights on YouTube. And the first fight that I pull up, he's fighting some guy who's a former football player who lines up like a defensive lineman. The fight starts. He sprints towards Sean Sharaf and just runs right into an uppercut and gets knocked out in 9 seconds. So Sharaf is 4-0. All 4 of his wins have come by first round knockout. But like, he's fighting washed up football players. He's fighting truck drivers. So I don't know what to make of any of these performances. He seems to have power. He seems to be a pretty good athlete for a heavyweight. I don't know if he could wrestle or grapple. He probably can't, because most heavyweights can. And that's the path to victory against Junior Tafa. If you're able to wrestle, you probably win. If you don't wrestle, you probably get knocked out. So I have to favor Junior Tafa to win because of the limited amount of data that we have on Sean Sharaf. But I mean, there's such a wide range of outcomes in this fight, and there's such limited information. I don't think Junior Tafa is any good, that I'm willing to take some shots on Sharaf for sure in GPPs. Just be aware that there's a very high likelihood that he just gets killed in like 45 seconds or something like that. So high variance heavyweight fight, but I do think the winner probably should score pretty well, and I think the fight is going to end in a finish. So it's one I'm going to be targeting in GPPs. Preference towards the Tafa side, but Sharaf is going to be like an unowned punt play who draws some interest, just kind of the unknown element about him. Julia Polastri taking on Corey McKenna. I don't really know exactly what to make of this fight. Here's the good news, though. You just don't have to play it. It's one that I think could go one of two ways. I think either Polastri is going to be able to keep the fight standing and then probably win a point-based decision on the feet, which just wouldn't score all that well for DraftKings purposes. If Corey McKenna ends up winning, she is probably going to have to do it from the wrestling and grappling. Polastri only defends takedowns at a 42% clip. Outside of the UFC, we have seen her struggle to get up after being taken down. Corey McKenna does often go into fights with really poor game plans. There's times that she should wrestle, that she doesn't wrestle. Like, for instance, the fight against Elise Reed, where everybody knows if you fight Elise Reed, you just chain wrestle and you get yourself a free win. It happens in basically every single Elise Reed fight, but Corey McKenna opted to not really do that. She did land 3 takedowns, but she should have just stuck on the takedown. She would have ended up winning pretty easily. Instead, she stayed on the feet a lot with Elise Reed, and Reed ended up outpointing her and winning a decision. And Corey McKenna is going to be the lesser striker in just about every single matchup that she ever has. So she should be looking to wrestle in this fight, but we can't really count on it for her either. It's a fight that I'm looking to pass on. I'll pick Polastri to win by decision, but it's a low confidence pick and easy enough to just be avoiding this fight for DraftKings purposes. A couple fights left to talk about. Next one here, Dan Argueta against Cody Haddon. And I don't like Dan Argueta as a real-life prospect, and I do think there's a little bit of upside to Cody Haddon as a real-life prospect. We saw him with a pretty impressive win on the Contender Series, but this is going to be the UFC debut for Haddon. Oftentimes we see decent-sized favorites coming off the Contender Series kind of shit the bed when they come and make their UFC debut. But what I like about Dan Argueta is he's almost always the underdog in his fights. And when he does win, it's a DraftKings friendly style. We know what we're getting out of Dan Argueta. He's going to come with pace and pressure, especially in the early going of fights, and he's going to shoot a ton of takedowns. He lands north of 4 takedowns per 15 minutes. So when you see Dan Argueta win, which once again doesn't happen all that often, but like in the win against Nick Aguirre, he lands 4 takedowns. Even some of his losses, his last loss against Gene Matsumoto, he landed 9 takedowns before he got submitted at the very end of the second round. He was looking really good in the early going of that fight. So Dan Argueta is definitely an underdog that I want to be getting some exposure to. I have him in nearly 30% of lineups right now. And then on the other side with Cody Haddon, he's also somebody I have a little bit of interest in as well, because there is this scenario here where if Dan Argueta is not able to land takedowns against Cody Haddon, I think he's probably going to be able to knock out Dan Argueta. And he's only $8,700 and project for 26% ownership. So I like both sides of the fight, but I'll be higher on the Haddon side. There's certainly viability looking at Dan Argueta for the punt play, just because, like I said, if he wins, it's going to have to be wrestling based. But Haddon's going to be my preferred side of this fight. And one fight left to target. And maybe my overall favorite pay-up option on the entire slate is Clayton Carpenter. So he is $8,800. He's pulling some ownership, but nothing like super chalky or anything like that. I'll probably go into the Sims and actually manually boost the ROI of Clayton Carpenter just to get him into more lineups, because I think this is a great matchup on paper for Clayton Carpenter. We haven't seen him fight for a very extended period of time. His last fight was, February of 2023. So looking at about a 1.5 year layoff for Clayton Carpenter. But here's what I like about the matchup against Lucas Rocha. In his Contender Series fight, which he did end up winning, he got himself a second round finish. But in the first round, he was taken down 5 times. So now you've got a guy in Lucas Rocha who's fighting a much higher level of fighter in Clayton Carpenter than what he fought on the Contender Series, and somebody who is a very good wrestler and grappler. Clayton Carpenter landing about 2.5 takedowns per 15 minutes. If you looked at his fight on the Contender Series, he fought Edgar Chairez, which relative to competition guys fight on the Contender Series, I mean, Edgar Chairez is a UFC level fighter, not like a high level fighter or anything, but he's somebody who belongs in the UFC. And Clayton Carpenter looked pretty good in that matchup, landing 3 takedowns, and then he got a submission in his UFC debut. So I think this is probably the easiest matchup that Clayton Carpenter has had so far in the UFC, whereas Rocha is fighting in his most difficult matchup of his entire career, and it's one that I think stylistically is really good for Clayton Carpenter on paper, considering that we just saw Rocha take down 5 times in the Contender Series in 1 round. So I'm picking Clayton Carpenter to win, and if he comes with a wrestling-based game plan after we saw from Rocha in the Contender Series, you could see a spot here where Carpenter gets a submission, maybe lands 6, 7, 8 takedowns or something like that. So pulling 30% ownership. I've been close to 40% of lineups right now, and I'd be more inclined to go over the current ownership I have on him than reducing it. I really like Clayton Carpenter as a pay-up option. So that is going to do it for us for this week, guys. If you haven't done yet, do me a favor, like the video, subscribe to the YouTube channel. And if you want to sign up for our MMA package, links down below in the YouTube description box. We have data-only packages. You just want data. If you want to sign up for our Sims, links for that down below as well. So, guys, good luck this week. See you back here next week. Peace out.